it mentions Bitcoin's role as a portfolio diversifier. How do you
Yeah.
see this changing traditional portfolio strategies, specifically for institutional investors?
Well, I think you got to understand how portfolios have been constructed over the last, say, 20 years, which is it's all based off this underlying relationship between bonds and stocks, right? So, and it's really related to the Fed and the central banks who come and intervene whenever markets drop. So, when stocks fall, the Fed comes in and cuts rates, which is good for bond prices. So, bonds have acted as this buffer for any time stocks have started to tumble. And so you combine them in a portfolio, and that's how you reduce risk, but then you have good risk adjusted returns, right? So it provides that diversification because they move a little bit differently. Now the problem is that relationship, that inverse relationship between bonds and stocks, it changes in inflationary environments because bonds don't do well in inflationary environments. And and so historically, you see when inflation comes up, you start to see that correlation start to become positive, and that's a problem for the way portfolios are constructed. And so what you're seeing in like the institutional investor world, looking at family offices or other investors, is they're all seeking alternative assets, anything to provide that diversification that they're not going to get anymore from bonds, trying to hedge their equity positions with, it could be anything. It could be gold, collectibles, actual real estate. But then there's Bitcoin, and Bitcoin has been shown to be very low, has low correlation with basically every other traditional asset class. And that's what BlackRock is talking about here. And that's why, they're speaking the institutional investor language. This is what they want to hear. They're like, oh my gosh, an uncorrelated asset. This is like the holy grail of portfolio construction, to find something that not only outperforms, has a really good return profile, but does it in an uncorrelated way. That's really attractive. And so when you have a really high return profile, you can actually have a little goes a long way, which is also attractive for these people because it might be a little bit scary. But even if they own a little bit, it can really change the return profile or the risk adjusted returns of the portfolio. So that's kind of what BlackRock's talking about, and makes a lot of sense. It's why like the Wisconsin pension funds going into it, right? They don't need to go into it a lot. But it's funny because when you actually run the numbers, the bigger the allocation, the better it gets actually in terms of risk adjusted returns. But right now we'll be okay with like a little bit here and there for these big fishes.
Absolutely. Do you believe that Bitcoin's long-term uncorrelation with traditional assets will continue? Or do you foresee like it aligning more closely with other risk assets moving forward?
It's a good question. That's a really good question. What's interesting is if like what happens when a majority of the S&P 500 companies own Bitcoin on their balance sheets, like MicroStrategy. What happens there? Or like even over a long enough time frame, if we're right, then the companies who adopt a corporate treasury strategy before the other companies are going to outperform their competitors. They're going to get larger market caps. They're going to be able to, they're going to have more of a robust balance sheet to make acquisitions, acquire their competitors. They're going to become most of the S&P 500, and then they're going to own a lot of Bitcoin. So you would think that their prices would start to track Bitcoin, or at least become a little bit more correlated over time. I could see that happening. Yeah, I think equities is the interesting one in terms of like gold and, I think gold is kind of the low hanging fruit with Bitcoin, where it really does improve on a lot of gold's shortcomings. And so it makes sense to me. And like, there's a lot of overlap between the narratives, right? Between gold and Bitcoin right now. And I think a lot of gold investors might take a little bit chunk of gold and buy a little bit of Bitcoin with it. And so I don't really see how those would be that correlated. And over time, over long periods of time. Bonds, not so much. Bonds are just would not own bonds.
I don't know why anyone would. And then specifically now that Bitcoin's a thing, right? Like I think governments are going to have a very difficult very difficult situation in the future trying to sell these things. It just doesn't make sense in my opinion. And let's see how that happens. But anyways, I did want to ask
Good
you a
question.
question. I did want to ask you a question, Sam, which is like, and forgive me for my Miami pronunciation of the company's name, but you have Michael Saylor literally putting his graphics, and MicroStrategy is outperforming Nvidia. Okay, like in what world would that happen? But it's what you were saying. It's the mere fact that MicroStrategy has adopted a Bitcoin strategy and has Bitcoin on its treasury. Now all of a sudden it's, it's benefiting from it, and that doesn't require such an extreme measure from other companies. Like if you're Apple or if you're Google, you have a tremendous amount of cash or cash equivalents that are literally just sitting there like melting ice cubes. I think the first, company that just goes in there and says, you know what, maybe we're not going to go as ham as Michael Saylor. Maybe we put in 5% or 2% or 3%. Not only are they going to maintain their purchasing power, but also now they're going to have a major competitive advantage compared to any other company that doesn't do it. And
Yeah.
what's really interesting as well is, as much as people hate Elon because the whole Doge thing and whatever, both his companies, Tesla and SpaceX, have about roughly a little bit less than 10,000 Bitcoin each. So I find that quite interesting because that isn't just a pure Bitcoin play. Like Tesla is a very successful car manufacturer, and they do have a sizable holding in Bitcoin. So when do you think that's going to happen? Like, who's the first domino to fall? Is it Apple? Is it Google? Is it Meta? Do you agree that it gives them a competitive advantage compared to companies that don't put Bitcoin or replace some of their cash reserves with Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, just like an individual who adopts Bitcoin has a competitive advantage over somebody who doesn't over long periods of time. Life is getting cheaper for Bitcoiners. Life will get cheaper for Bitcoin companies as well. It's like it's the age old, you can't protect yourself from somebody else adopting a harder form of money. So it's the same thing. And I think River put out a great report. They said even a 3% allocation to Bitcoin with 97% cash would protect them against inflation, given Bitcoin's return profile. So, like I said, a little bit goes a long way for these corporations. So, it's kind of a no brainer, but I think it's a big paradigm shift in how these corporate treasurers think. I think we're still in the early days. And I think it happens on the margins. I think it's kind of like what we've been seeing, which is smaller companies like the Semler Scientifics, One MedNet, um, brought up MetaPlanet. Yeah, I think that's what we're going to see. These kind of like companies come out of nowhere who are Bitcoiners who are just like, yeah, this makes sense. We're going to do this. And then there will probably be like a white swan moment. Who knows, like a Michael Dell situation, or one of these big companies that comes in, and that's going to make headlines, and that's going to be a really interesting moment. But yeah, it's just kind of a no-brainer, and it's really a function of the macro environment. It's like what we said, there's so many reasons to believe that we are entering a regime change in terms of the macroeconomic environment, where the past 30 years we've been in this deflationary environment where rates just continuously fall, inflation is low, and now it just seems like things are changing, and we're entering this structural inflationary period where every single entity that has to deal with money, whether it's a corporation, an investment firm, money managers, individuals, are going to have to rethink how to preserve wealth and build wealth in this new environment. It's been decades and decades and decades of the same thing, and now it just seems like things are changing. And so, yeah, the companies that lead and who are forward thinking and who have the ability to adopt a Bitcoin treasury strategy before others, I think will absolutely have a competitive advantage.
100%. And how do you think the increased institutional adoption of Bitcoin will affect its price stability and long-term value, because it's a little bit different now, right? It's not just a bunch of hardcore Bitcoin maxis that are, holding the majority. I think that is still the case. I saw a graphic by River that showed that I think 11 million out of the 21 million Bitcoin are still held by individuals, which I think is very positive. But
Yeah, that's good.
how do you think it will affect the volatility now that you have these large institutional players coming in? Is it going to increase the volatility? Is it going to decrease it? Is it going to stabilize it over a long period of time? I mean, I'm assuming what's going to happen is, you have these portfolio allocations of 1-2%. Then Bitcoin performs very well, becomes 5% of the portfolio. Then they have to reallocate the portfolio. They have to, that causes downward sell pressure. So, what's your take on that?
Well, I think it could definitely suppress, not like just reduce volatility over the long term. But you got to understand that rebalancing effect happens on the way down as well. So if
Mm,
Bitcoin drops, then they'll actually come in and buy. So they'll kind of create that floor on the other side too. And usually these money managers understand, uh, not to panic sell. I guess, nothing against the retail investor. It's just, I guess you could say they're more sophisticated investors, or the investor base is different, where you have like pension fund managers with very, very long time horizons who aren't going to panic and sell off their entire position. And they will be rebalancing on the way down too. Same with corporations. If you just like have a cash flow positive business that's like non-cyclical, just durable cash flows, profitable. They have a treasury strategy. They're going to put X% of their net operating profits in every single quarter. It's like clockwork. It's like a price insensitive buyer DCAing at a massive level. Um, that's that's a good thing. And we see it with Block and Tether right now, where they're putting in a percentage of their operating profits into Bitcoin, and that's insane. I mean, and think about if that happens on a much, much larger scale. The similar strategy starts to get adopted by all kinds of businesses and corporations. So I do think the volatility will decrease with adoption. I think that's actually what we've seen when you just look at intraday or intraday volatility. It has decreased over time, and I think we'll continue to see that with adoption. I do believe in the law of large numbers. It just makes sense where we might not see these like crazy, crazy returns. But at the same time, we are so early that the opportunity is still incredible, in my opinion, with how little adoption there actually is right now and how the institutions are just getting their toes wet here. I still think we have a, step function upwards in price appreciation ahead of us before we get into these more like modest returns. And then
mhm.
even then, I still think it like outperforms, say the S&P 500 or something, just because of its properties and its scarcity and all the things that we know as Bitcoiners. But yeah, I think the volatility would drop. I think it's kind of natural as adoption grows. I think the institutions bring a different investor base into the game that's less like speculative in nature and just more have long term theses. Won't panic sell the bottoms. Um, yeah, I think that makes sense, right? Do you think that too?
Absolutely, it 100% makes sense.